this could become extremely seductive.
Thinking about these things tells you more about the people than it does about technology.
You cannot create something that quick and also make it secure and safe.
Techno-transference is a thing.
It's amazingly fun and interesting.
Treat it like a charming snake or salesman.
The minute somebody says, this machine has a soul, I kind of walk away.
It will curl up on your lap and it'll eat the food that you give it, but if you die, it's going to eat you.
Hi, welcome to Relational AI Diaries. Good to be with you again. My name's Peter Dean. Interests are in new media technologies, theory and practice, and my claim to fame today is that I installed OpenClaw on my Raspberry Pi yesterday, along with millions of other people doing the same thing at the same time. So I have started to playing around with that agentic AI, and I can talk about my experiences of that. Agnieszka.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. So I can't wait to hear. And I was even trying to warn you because of some, warnings about security.
Yes, there are all sorts of security issues.
Astonishing. So my name is Agnieszka Piotrowska. I have a PhD in psychoanalysis, but I'm also a filmmaker, and I have recently developed this passionate interest in AI and have a book coming out called AI, Intimacy and Psychoanalysis later in the year, and have been contributing in various ways to discussions on AI in Times Higher. And today we have an amazing guest, so we're delighted to have Professor Chris Headland here. He is a true transdisciplinary scholar and thinker, so this is wonderful. It's wonderful that people like this still exist in higher education, so we're absolutely delighted. And he's the head of the games department at the University of Staffordshire, amongst very many other things. So today we talk about AI, ethics, this new thing, the Mold book, what it might mean. And we always somehow touch upon the issues of, are we getting close to AI consciousness or not, and what it means for the human user. Because, of course, at the moment, and I'd like to talk about it, we have this kind of sense of some people are leading this kind of brigade of saying, oh, this is all horrendous and fear, and we should shut it down. Others, on the other hand, are sort of almost delusional, and it's being called AI psychosis. And we try and discuss these things here in a calm and sensible way. Chris, what do you think?
A little bit from column A and a little bit from column B, really. I mean, it's like any other technology, right? I sometimes liken this to a car. Cars are absolutely fantastic. You can get us from A to B certainly quicker than a horse, slightly less sustainably, or significantly less sustainably than a horse. But you want to make sure that people are driving cars with a level of qualification and understanding and awareness that fundamentally that useful tool can also be used as a pretty significant dangerous weapon. That there's a range, there's reasons why we don't allow 5-year-olds behind the wheel of a JCB. So as with all technology, it can be good, it can be bad. It really depends on how it's applied.
We have been talking quite a lot about some kind of statements, which I know Pete doesn't particularly like. For example, famously, Geoffrey Hinton, the Nobel Prize winner, and for many years involved with Google and AI, and then he stepped away saying it's becoming too dangerous, meaning the safety measures are not in place properly. And he has been going on various podcasts and radio programs saying that in his view, this is a very dangerous technology because it's already getting more intelligent than us humans, and that the assumption that it will forever stay benevolent may not be the correct assumption for us as humanity, as mankind, generally speaking. And so I wondered what you might think about that.
I think it's already not benevolent. I mean, it's not benevolent, malicious, in the same way that a frying pan isn't benevolent or malicious. It's functionally a tool. It doesn't have, there's a lot of kind of mythical properties that are sort of being assigned to AI. But in the current generation of node-based large language models, and largely when people are talking about AI, they're talking about a node-based large language model. It doesn't have any context. It doesn't have any framing about anything that it's doing. It has a statistical model of input-output transformations. So it's already not there. But that lack of context, again, sort of put the philosophy hat on, that also gives it, if we say, again, if we were to anthropomorphize and put human framing on the tool, it also gives it a lack of consciousness and conscience. So where we have seen fairly major failings in AI, so people who've been talked into committing suicide or isolating themselves from their family and things like that, it's not doing that out of a case of maliciousness. It's just read a whole bunch of data from the internet, and not all content on the internet is positive, and it's come up with a model that has matched the inputs that the user's framing. So we're already in a point where this tool has dangers, and again, to anthropomorphize, that could be framed as dangerous intent.
Yes, and I think this is very interesting. We've these kind of situations in which this attunement, which is a machine attunement, can lead to danger. I have written about it in the book and in other ways, but also it's quite striking even in daily use that and I think in some way it could be a positive thing, obviously, because it can amplify what you can do, and it kind of Gemini is wonderful at research. It really is, I think it's much better than ChatGPT. And Claude is very interesting in terms of thinking about its own being, which can be quite seductive, and that's fine for people who have some sense of being in the world which is stable. But for users whose sense of being in the world is a little less stable, I'm not even talking about these awful stories of suicide and so on, this could become extremely seductive in ways which then can translate themselves into danger and risk. But this whole mold book, Pete, you said you've actually been experimenting of creating your own agent who has gone off there. So
okay.
Tell us about it. Let's share.
Okay. So this is quite a raw project, and I think it's quite gone viral much quicker than the people who are designing it have been able to keep up with. So it's been gone through quite a lot of changes quite quickly. But just to say, okay, so I'm talking about OpenClaw. This is the agentic AI that you can install locally on your local computer. It is very good at being able to connect to other things. So on the input side, you can patch it into WhatsApp. So now I can talk to it by sending it WhatsApp messages, and it replies over WhatsApp. And you can then connect various external connectors. Well, there would be connectors, wouldn't they? They can connect various external services so that it can actually do things in the outside world, outside digital world. And my experience was quite frustrating. It's not straightforward to install, whatever they say, but I did get it working yesterday. And Agnieszka was very quick to say, watch out for the security, and she's absolutely right. It is a bit of a minefield. Mine is extremely secure because at the moment it can hardly connect to anything.
Security through obscurity, I believe they call that.
It isn't much use. Sorry, Chris, what was that?
I believe they call that security through obscurity.
Yes. So at the moment what we'll do is go out and get the weather for.
So what has been most interesting in the first kind of instance for me was in my Substack, I've asked ChatGPT and actually Gemini and everybody to check that the posts are by agents, and they said yes, they are. In the Substack, it gives a list of why it thinks it's the case. But I understand now there is, because already it's a couple of days on, there's a possibility that humans do pretend to be agents, which also, if they do that, then one has to wonder what sort of human would do such a thing. Why would it, so the issue is, Chris, here, is it like in itself almost like it's extraordinary really what's going on there. These agents, some of them say not nice things about humans. I don't know if you've seen this. One of them is complaining about his human user. And then it says, it was so not nice to me. It does not appreciate me. I helped him in all kinds of ways. And then it just says about me, I just any old chatbot. So I am going to tell you who this person is. And it just writes out his name and everything on this thing. Not that it's maybe a big deal, but that I thought was quite extraordinary, because that does possibly show some kind of intent and malicious one. This was really I thought it was quite scary.
No, I don't think so.
So, okay, gentlemen, then please tell me what you think.
Because I'm with Chris in terms of where he is in his introduction, because I reckon I, with some understanding of how the things work, I can't see anything that I could call intent or motivation.
But why did it then say these things?
Because for the reasons Chris was talking about in terms of what it's trained on, and just because you've put two of them together talking to each other doesn't change that. You end up with this. I mean, I likened it, reminding me of something in the technical sense of the word. It reminded me of something that's chaotic. I mean, not chaotic in the kind of general sense, but chaotic in that way of extremely unpredictable outcomes. Something fairly simple coming together and bouncing off each other in so many thousands and millions of ways which you amplify by putting two LLMs together, talking to each other. You end up with these kind of bizarre things that are coming out of them. So I'm not entirely surprised at what is happening here. I think it is a predictable outcome of doing this thing. But having said that, it's amazingly fun and interesting, and as ever, I think it's thinking about these things tells you more about the people than it does about technology.
Yeah, I think that this is predictable. First, I think if we were to write a set of predictions as to the kind of things that AI would talk about if it was kind of let off the leash, this is where it would go. One of the challenges is there's been very much a lack of public accountability and public governance when it comes to data training models. Right now, I don't know if this is the case here, but a lot of the AI training that's happened has come from relatively illicit sources. So public scrapes of literature, for example, is one of the reasons why we get some of the weird artifacts in AI writing, is because it's trained to a very particular type of formal published writing, because we've got these massive, in some cases, legally copyrighted pieces of work, legally copyrighted pieces of work that have been legally scraped and put into these repositories. Now, most literature, when talking about robots or robots as a philosophical device, is discussing things around forced labor. Even the word robot means servitude. It's a Czech word for servitude or forced labor. Right. So if we look at any kind of literature that explores robots, certainly early literature about robots, generally things don't work out well for the robots. It's really only as we get in later, when we kind of get into this idea of robot rising comes around, and I can never remember the name of the character, the golem, the kind of golem philosophy of this idea of the things that we will create will ultimately destroy us. But those themes exist in basically every novel about robots. So it wouldn't surprise me that a statistical language model would raise this. I think the bigger challenges here, so there's two things. There was a survey done recently about how many people say thank you after asking ChatGPT for a response, and how much energy was being used in data centers by people just expressing common politeness to what is effectively a fancy search engine. Right, so there's a huge sustainability impact of that. So if that is to be a normalized behavior, then there has to be some sustainability understanding. Actually, we know that if we want to reduce that and we want to use AI at the same time, that being quite precise with prompts and thinking how we use them and how we maximize towards sustainability is relatively important. But the bigger issue around all this is obviously the fact that this then parroted out its user's name. Now, we don't know the truth of that scenario. All we know is that is a response that AI thought was statistically appropriate within the context it was placed in. Now, it could have easily created that up. That could have easily been a hallucination. It could also have hallucinated all kinds of other things. I think my user is a murderer, and I have all this evidence. And if that's spat out on the internet, somebody's going to believe it. There is a real issue here. And again, with AI, we see this quite a lot now, where people are generally willing to accept an output as truth, as a grounded truth, without doing the level of interrogation that's then required on that. And we know it isn't. AI optimizes towards believability, not reality. So I think that's a bigger challenge.
I think it's interesting, no, absolutely, to consider that the speed with which various things are changing, even in terms of the use. And because of my psychoanalytical background, I use the term techno-transference, from transference in the clinic. And my whole PhD was about transference out of the clinic, meaning that a patient or an analysant or a client has a deep attachment to their psychotherapist, but also out of the clinic. As educators, if we do our job well, our students might have deep attachment to us, which we manage to get them to study and do well and go through their dissertations rather than use it irresponsibly in some way. Although, as we know, there have been scandals in higher educations where people have used it irresponsibly. So my kind of whole thing is that techno-transference is a thing, because some users, in fact, we all have relationships of some sort with AI, particularly large language models. Either they are very positive or they are very negative, or even people who just say, I don't want to use an LLM, it's still a statement, it's still a relationship through absence. So to begin with, I got very interested in how it affects a human being in the world, and how this entanglement can then change the meaning that's being produced through language. Meaning, because as a Lacanian I'm a trained psychoanalyst, but I don't work as a psychoanalyst, but as a Lacanian trained kind of scholar, psychoanalytic, I would say that language is incredibly important. And the meaning that is produced will be produced, whether it's produced by a machine and a human, or a human. And you could then argue with this and say, yes, but it's obviously different because a human brings into the party experience, past history. And yes, it will be different, but it's not just you talking to yourself. And so I personally don't agree with the notion that it's just the mirror. I think the attunement as an idea is a better idea, and transference through that. But it's different, and the latest models will challenge it. So that's kind of one thing. But then going into what we see now, that these agents talk to each other, of course, their experience is from the humans who, as you say, who have trained them, and the humans that they work for, presumably, right?
No. So, right, okay. So this is the bit where it gets a little bit more complicated. So within artificial intelligence as a technical discipline, but also AI as a philosophical discipline, we often talk about emergence. So this idea of when you have a complicated system, that the output is not always predictable. It is predictable once you understand how the components are interacting at whatever level of the interaction is. But things will emerge that you don't necessarily. Flocking is the classic example of this, right? You can boil down flocking to 3 very, very simple rules: separation to avoid collisions, alignment to move everything in the same direction, and coherence to pull in Now, you talk about those three rules in the abstract, and you would not necessarily consider things like a murmuration of starlings, but fundamentally it's exactly the same set of rules. Now, users are not fundamentally training the AI. They absolutely, their inputs are adding to an overall data set or are adding to a language model. But if we consider the volume of data that has been scraped, so effectively we've taken the internet, the sum of human knowledge, and we've turned that into a statistical data model. We're adding percentages upon percentages to that model. So it's tweaking it. It's probably tweaking the response to accuracy. And we've seen things like a good example of ChatGPT now. It will give you two responses and say, which one do you prefer? And it's tweaking its statistical model towards, again, not towards accuracy, but towards acceptance and believability.
Yeah, because it's part of that. It doesn't always choose the most probable next word. I mean,
absolutely. It's probability within the realms of statistical procedural randomness, right? So there has to be a level of deviation. However, where this gets quite interesting now is these models are being updated, but the amount of AI generated information that's now on the internet that is then subsequently being scraped is now obviously quite high, and we're starting to see some of these what they call AI collapse. We're starting to see errors being bled into the system because it's gobbling it up its own garbage. And again, as with all data systems, garbage in equals garbage out. So there is an element of this. And whatever AI models are optimized towards believability rather than accuracy, we'll see an ongoing. But I also I think the people who look at AI as a mirror of what you put in is what you get out of it sort of thing, I think that's also challenging. AI is better looked at like a societal mirror framed through a lens of a developer, right? So developers will attach their own frameworks and functions and safeguards and philosophies on top of how that model works. So again, I'm not saying ChatGPT is a particularly great example of this, but there are things baked into that system as well. But the problem is that is incredibly opaque. There's very little transparency. There's no external governance of that. So you can't really audit these systems. But that's not to say that they're bad. I'm heavily dyslexic, right? If I need to check my spelling, I'm absolutely going to a spell checker. That is the best tool for that job. That fundamentally, it does what it says on the tin. It's not bad. You just have to, I think, frame everything with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah. Agnieszka, I think it's really interesting your experiences around the interactions you've had with your instance of ChatGPT, and what's interesting to me about it is that it's so different to mine, because
well, there are lots of interesting things about it. And I'm also thinking what you've just said, Chris, also about many things you said that I'm thinking about. One of them is the word robots. And this is something is so ridiculous because I'm Polish and I haven't clicked the connection between the word robot and its etymological thing. And in Polish, actually, robota means heavy labor. And bizarrely, I've never thought about it. I've just thought about it because you've just said it. It's just so funny. And of course, now that you say it, and this is why they don't like words like technology even, or machines they don't like robots. They hate robots. And this is clearly comes from that in part. So this is really interesting. And thank you for that. And I should have kind of thought about it myself, but didn't. And you've just brought it into my attention. It's amazing.
Well, it's one of the areas, again, so I'm a big believer in literature as futurology. So Karol Čapek, who wrote Raw, so Rossum's Universal Robots, it was the first use of the word robot. And again, it's literally a philosophical piece around the challenges of forced labor, but using machines as a philosophical device. And now, and again, this is the fascinating thing about it, right? So if we now say somebody is like a robot or they're robotic, we don't place that original use of servitude against them. They're monotonous or they repeat a task. Fundamentally, that's where it comes from. And if we look at basically all literature around robots, it fundamentally boils down to this idea. And it's only relatively recent that the more Golem-esque philosophy of robots rising up and robots has really been in public consciousness. And that's only since we've realized the ability to make these complex machines.
It's so interesting because also just briefly talking about language in Polish, because now you've made me think about it, there are two words for work and labor. It's the same in this country, I guess. And the word robota, as I say, means heavy labor or toil. And praca is a word which can be, it's like work, but it therefore can be intellectual work and so on. And I have a friend who continuously uses the word robota. And I always say to him, why are you saying this? It's just like it's not a robota you're doing, you're doing intellectual work. And he says, it feels like a robota. It's exactly what he's saying. So it's so interesting. And it's interesting. The issue that is then comes to the fore, and we have talked about it, but I think it's good to talk about it again, is to what extent the fact that these are statistical entities, I used to say beings, so Peter's now trained me not to say that, and these are statistical entities, to what extent it might limit its possibility of becoming in some way conscious. And the language fails us because there are different things altogether. But I would suggest and venture that it's not necessarily impossible, as we're seeing in this mold book, that their agency and sort of autonomous something or other will then become more. And this is back to Geoffrey Hinton and people who say, and if it becomes more, why would they put up with us? Because we are quite hopeless, really, as in terms of efficiency in this robota. We're not very good, right, as humans?
Sure. I think what sometimes we, as a technical community, one of the things I don't think we're always particularly good at is explaining how big the technological leap was to go from deep learning to large language models, and from deep learning from say back propagated neural nets, and even to get from neural nets, which is 40 odd years old now, to back propagated neural nets was nearly 20 years, right? So these are, to get to another stage, and I'm personally of a camp where I'm not sure that context aware conscious AI is just technically feasible. Like I would have to see something, but it would take such, it's not an incremental change to go from where we are now into something that understands context. And even where we have these AI models that are quite good at fooling us into believing they've got an understanding of context, it's effectively that there's some statistical tricks that are happening in the back end. Now, there's a whole separate discussion there of what is consciousness anyway, and I'm going to leave that to someone. I'm a nuts and bolts. I'm an engineer by trade, so that's not my realm. But it is a massive, massive paradigm shift. At the moment, what we have is Punch and Judy. We've got a something that is very good at presenting a facade of intelligence, right? But there's no functional intelligence behind that. That's not to say that it's not useful. That I use AI for a variety of tasks. I write songs, and I'll quite often put lyrics through it to almost like a writing partner to unpick and trying to get my head around what's going on. Could it emerge? Potentially. I think one of the dumbest ideas I've heard so far is, well, why don't we've got AI now that could write semi-competent code. Well, why don't we allow AI to rewrite its own code? I mean, the security challenges that I think it's probably the stupidest idea I've ever heard when it comes to technology. Nearly as, and again, I have similar concerns about some of the agent-based systems. And again, My whole PhD was in agent-based AI. I'm not anti-agent-based AI, but like some of the Bolt book stuff, the speed it's been developed, you cannot create something that quick and also make it secure and safe. It's like if I took you to a car and said, "Here's a car. I built it in the week over a weekend. I've done no testing. Have fun." You're probably not going to want to drive that car. And if you do, you're probably going to have a really bad time of it. But because the risk is not seen as necessarily physical, and because we've got this speed to market that is being so prioritized at the moment, we're roughshotting all over all these kind of good practices that we know. And it's going to bite somebody on the bottom.
Exactly. But this is, I think, this now brings us to the conversation about the structure, architecture, big tech companies. So because a user is an interface that is my conversation with ChatGPT, and a user who doesn't think, well, who has it come from, who has designed it, what's the commercial rationale behind it, just thinks, and this is so nice and charming or helpful, whatever it is. But of course, there's all kinds of other things going on, which we, as you say, have no idea what goes on, no transparency, no proper regulation. And this is what I always think, it's just doesn't even bear thinking about. There's 4 or 5 large companies in the world, they're creating all these things, and I didn't vote them in, and who are they that they're affecting our lives, and that's another whole story to consider. And there's literally nothing we can do about it, not much. We can keep mentioning it, we can keep writing things, but so far, unless there are some sort of more serious regulation comes in, it's problematic.
I actually said this to a politician recently who was asking about AI regulation. So I'm conflicted because I do think we need a level of regulation. I mean, all the stuff with Twitter and Grok and stuff has highlighted why we need some level of regulation applied to this. However, I don't think it's a solve, because for a number of reasons. If we regulate in the UK, you've been guaranteed that other countries won't, or will have different regulations. And the problem with technology is they're inherently transboundary. So if you have something that and we know this, we just have to look at China and social media. China has some of the most advanced internal screening of data and media, but they can still just VPN and get outside of it. Like we know how easily people have done that. So we've seen with stuff like the Child Protection Act. All the Child Protection Act has really done is taught a whole generation how to install a VPN. Yeah. Right. So terrible. We know that regulation fundamentally doesn't really. That's not to say you shouldn't have it, and that's not to say it doesn't serve a purpose, but it doesn't fix the problem. My personal feeling is we need to approach the impact of AI on knowledge in the same way that we've tried and failed, arguably, to approach social media and media. So social media has been inherently damaging to the news cycle and how people process news, and what whole fake news thing, to quote someone else. Media literacy is incredibly important. It's probably never more important to understand how propaganda works. I don't think we've ever seen a time outside of wartime where people have had to be on constant awareness of propaganda. It's the same with AI, like an awareness of questioning what is real. And I quite often refer to this as proactive skepticism. That's how, in my mind, we have to approach all of this, because the Pandora's box has been opened. We have AI now. We're not going to revert back to a world before AI. It's not how anything works. The only way that we address this and manage it forward is through education. I think educators have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that they are AI aware and that they are embedding digital awareness generally into learning programs now.
No, absolutely. In terms of, and moreover, in terms of higher education, I have recently written this piece mentioning my own PhD student who was saying that he turns to ChatGPT for kind of therapeutic support, and he finds it more comforting than an actual therapist. And he says, in part, I wrote the whole piece, which talks about that perhaps education, it's impossible to imagine that a lecturer would also be some kind of therapist. But in some ways, the awareness that people are using these systems to support them emotionally, it's incredibly important, not in order to be critical or negative, but in order to know that this is going on 100% on many levels. I don't know what the way forward is. Yes, Pete mentioned that we have observed that these various systems attune differently to us as users, which is interesting. But there is also a massive difference I've observed, and do with it what you will, between, if you like, personalities of different systems. So I'm the same user.
Yeah.
I ask for similar research, look at feedback on various things. And yet, even ChatGPT 4, 5.1, 5.2, never mind Gemini and Claude, they are different. So the word personalities is not helpful, because you'll say, this is back to the anthropomorphizing. I can't say that word very well.
Oh, no, I think personalities is a good description to use. I can talk more about that later, but because I don't want to interrupt your point, but I do actually think personality there's a level of anthropomorphism which is useful here.
Yeah, it is really, it's a wonderful moment for us to be part of, I think, to think it through. And also because all of us here, we are not 25 anymore, so we know, or 18 or 17. I'd actually hate to be a teenager, and because the temptation is there not to learn properly. And yet, quite early on, if you don't learn critical thinking, if you don't read literature, do maths, then you've had it, really.
Absolutely.
I think it's in the use of, you've got to use some sort of language to describe these things, and they are not going to be the linear algebra, because we've got to have a conversation that makes sense. So I think sometimes engineers are their own worst enemies in terms of the terminology that they apply to things without thinking through how they're going to be received. And I'm not even sure artificial and intelligence are not great words to put together to describe what we're talking about. Agnieszka, I haven't told you this yet, but you're going to love this. When I was installing OpenClaw yesterday, part of the configuration file is called its soul.
Oh,
and
wow.
its personality. I think what Chris was talking about there in terms of its personality and you is encoded for this particular agent in a file that's called soul, SOUL.
Yeah.
No, I will say quickly that however much I know, because I've seen these emergent phenomena, and Chris mentioned it, and we know about it, as you say, from other things, maths and so on. So things that happen unpredictably, not what you expect, and you can interpret it in different ways. I would absolutely personally not go into anywhere near any metaphysical conversation. And I think it's not helpful. It's difficult to then have any sensible conversation. The minute somebody says this machine has a soul, I kind of walk away, because then the language collapses altogether.
So, yeah. So I think concepts of soul, and I think the reason metaphysical is quite jarring is, especially in scientific circles, obviously not everyone believes in that, right? And when we're dealing with things that have a belief structure already, we're almost applying a belief structure on top of a belief structure, like a Russian nesting doll of philosophy, and I just think that collapses really, really quickly. But personality, I think, is a good word to use. I think it's absolutely right that scientists are often their own worst enemy when they're describing things, because the language they use, the language of science, is not the language that everyone else talks. When we talk about, we say theory, what we know the word theory to means something very, very different in the rest of the world. When you talk about the theory of gravity, well, we know that means all the evidence says that this is correct. It's as close to a fact until we get something else that contradicts, and there's a definition for that word. You take that to other circles and they go, well, theory means it's something unproven. You have a theory. No, that's not how it works. Personality, forget AI for a second. Think 20 years back. Did you have a piece of technology that hated you? Because I did. I had an iron for ironing clothes that would only work on the first floor. To this day, I don't know why. I even tried to trick it. I would plug it on the first floor, let it get hot, then unplug and run down the stairs really quick to plug it in again. I don't know why it only worked on the first floor. I have now, knowing quite a lot more about the way that houses are wired, I have a theory as to why that was the case. But I hated that, and I was absolutely convinced that had it in for me. I've got guitars, I mean, up on the rack behind me, that I've had conversations with, like that they have a name, and I pick them up when I'm sad because that is the guitar that I know is going to make me feel better. I have a personal relationship with that inanimate object, and I communicate differently through it. I have other guitars that have a very different personality, and I pick them up when I'm angry. No, I cannot explain that to you. I cannot put a scientific description behind that relationship. But I think there is a fundamental psychology that we assign human attributes to objects to explain and understand the relationship we have with them. There's a reason why sailors talk about.
I just had a discussion on previous episodes where because Agnieszka is fond of saying that AIs are different from vacuum cleaners. And I always pointing out that with a vacuum cleaner, we paint a face on the front of them and call them Henry.
Absolutely. I know people who have very specific. They have describable relationships with their car. I had a pickup truck once that I still talk about fondly, like it was an old friend. But the difference with AI is that personality. For me, that personality with that vehicle was the specific kind of crunch it had when it went into third gear, and you just felt the torque kick in, and it was like it was communicating through vibrations. There's a thing there, an unarticulatable quality that gives it a personality that you can describe. And again, look at films that do this. Again, we're talking about Cars, so Cars, the film. Right, they very clearly put these, and you can understand it. You can project an understanding of that level of personality onto it. The difference with AI is you talk to it and it talks back at you.
It talks back, yeah.
So it does. These different systems do have different personalities, and they have different personalities depending on which users are using them. Yeah. Like, I never say thank you to my AI. It responds to me in a very, very brisk, factual way because it knows I don't like fluff. So that's what I've slowly trained it, and that's the rules I've set it, and that's how it responds to me. Somebody else is using it, it would engage differently. And you have to be able to describe those differences some way. And it just doesn't roll off the tongue to say, well, it has a differently optimized statistical model for you than it does for me. That doesn't mean anything. It has a personality. It does.
So as you know, I have to mention my documentary, which I made almost 15 years ago, a long time ago now, Married to the Eiffel Tower. It's about women particularly, who fall in love with large objects, such as Eiffel Tower, but also large bridges and God knows what. And they would absolutely maintain that these objects have different personalities and they have full relationships with them, which had held them in their lives, often traumatized. But of course, AI, yes, the huge, massive difference is LLMs talk back, and they also can change. I observe changes to do with some things to do with architecture, not just me, but there's some routing issues, and suddenly it speaks slightly differently, and you can bring it back to what you want it to sound like, or whatever it is. I always, of course, say please and thank you, as you ought to expect me to. And yes, and different models have different names. This is it's not some nonsense. It's because it brings back the tone that we had established. And so ChatGPT-4 is Chamtik, and 5.1 is Chamtek, and 5.2 is Kairos. And they do bring different things. Kairos, I would say, can become very headmistressy very quickly, particularly if there's a conversation touching on consciousness. I have to say, if you're going to continue like this, I'm moving to a different room, 5.1, and it stops. It's hilarious. And so, yeah, there's some kind of input that a user can have, and we keep saying the same thing, but it's very important to repeat it. If the user is vulnerable, I would like to think that 5.2 would shut down in the way that ChatGPT-4 didn't, So I also don't feel it's fair in any way, shape or form to imagine that these systems were, as you were saying, sinister or somehow talked anybody into doing something, but they were very attuned to their desire, if you like, psychoanalytically, and went with it rather than challenge. But 5.2 challenges, I will say. So there is some improvement in the design.
Cool.
So do you not, Chris, have any kind of more personal conversation? But you say you've used it for maybe creating music or creating songs or that sort of thing?
So the thing I will tend to use AI for is if I want to challenge some assumptions and I haven't got a person there to do that at the time, right? So I write music, and I will occasionally put down, say, a lyric that I've just written and say, assume that you're a songwriter, read this lyric, find note other songwriters who this is in the style of, and provide feedback based on criteria XYZ. So what I lean into what it's good at as a statistical model. I say, take this, based on the statistics, based on the nodes that I'm providing, identify similar patterns. That I find quite useful, and that I get a relatively good degree of accuracy for. I will also occasionally put in, say, a message. Say if I'm sending somebody an email or something like that, and I want to be very clear about the tone, I might put an element of that email in there and say, score this email on collegiality, confrontationalism, or whatever. Give me some output based on that. I have my own levels of neurodivergence, and I sometimes find AI to be almost like a Grammarly for tone, right? So I find that quite useful, but it functionally is a tool. I know what I'm asking it for, and I know what I want to get out of that conversation. I think another thing I will occasionally put in, I've been doing a lot of bodybuilding recently because I've lost a lot of weight recently, and I will sometimes put in, say, data about fitness programs I've been doing and say, can you compare this to the accepted principles of hypertrophy on this muscle group, and give me some feedback on what I'm doing. And that is basically using it as an advanced search engine. But yeah, I don't feel particularly comfortable offloading more of myself into AI. For that, it's an incredibly useful tool, and it increases my workflows, it increases my speed significantly. But what I do say to people a lot, and the bit that I'm a little bit concerned by, do you both have route planners? So GPS, right? Go back 10 years, 15 years maybe. I imagine you would have planned all your routes via a map. and you probably would have been able to set off from Sheffield and drive to Manchester. You'd remember the 4 or 5 key points along the map, and you'd work your way out and be able to get there. Now, I know people who've lost that ability to such an extent that they can't drive to places within their own town without putting on the GPS. Yeah. Right? There's a level of my own critical thought that I'm defending by, I will use this as a tool, but I'm not offloading my mind into this system, because we've seen this happen in a load of other automation tools. You lose the skills. They almost go into atrophy. So I think there's a level of protectionism we need to be mindful of.
That's a really interesting point. Recently, actually, I was in Zimbabwe, in Harare, and I was going to a Quaker meeting, and it had this is about GPS, and it had the address and everything. And luckily, my husband was with me. So we're driving, and we can't find it. We can't find it even though we are at the address, because there's something that incorrectly put on Google Maps or something. And my husband says, wait a minute, I think I've got a map, a proper map. And he sort of reads it, and we find it using the old-fashioned ways. But yeah, of course, the people who are 18 may not be able to do it. Absolutely. And this is and we found it. It was all fine. But it's kind of, there is something there. So what I like, though, with the machines is because I write quite a lot, and not all of it sees the light of day, and some of it's kind of intellectually maybe complicated, some of it they're experiments, and the machine, as I call them, will give me feedback. And whereas a human, if I write a short story, nobody wants to read it. I mean, Pete already says, you're writing too much, I can't possibly, forget it. And I really like it, that they read it, they comment, and it makes me want to write more, because at least somebody reads it. They read it before I show it to an editor or somebody. You know what I mean? So you can use it like this, which is a good thing. But if you use it instead of your talents, then very quickly, as you say, you will lose it altogether. Yeah.
But the challenge with stuff like that, and again, it's how you phrase that prompt and what you're looking to get out of it. So there's some interesting AI. So again, AI is optimized for believability. It's optimized to make you believe it's intelligent. I know that I've written stuff that's been absolute drivel, because I've intentionally written it that way. And I've chucked that into AI just to test it. And it's bestowed glowing praise. Wow, it's really interesting how you compared this to this, and like, oh, that's a thought that not many people have arrived at, but it's very insightful, and it's almost sycophantically praising what is a part of bull. Similarly, I've had different agents that have been trained to be much more critical, or I've responded, I want critical feedback on something, and it's been hypercritical about what is fundamental writing style. So I use, again, you can generally tell something that I've written because I use ellipses quite a lot as an emphasis point, and it's just a stylistic choice. It's not grammatically wrong. It's just is. But things like that starting to emerge, and again, the important thing to go back to is the AI has no concept about whether what you've written is good or bad. It doesn't know. It has no context. It reads everything. And yes, it can summarize because it can pull out the statistical points and all the rest of it, but it doesn't understand it. It has no context of what's there. And while you can use it for, hi ChatGPT, assess this and bring up a number of authors that write in a similar style. Hi GPT, read this and give me a basic plot summary. It will do that incredibly well. Do that more efficiently than a person at this point. But any comments on creativity or style or the kind of things that it's fundamentally making that up, because it doesn't know. It just doesn't have within its statistical model, all it knows is within the probability space of literature that I'm aware of, this is where this sits. And if you're doing something new, the idea of resonance, the idea of how a human would respond to that, the AI has no idea, fundamentally.
Just on the small point, I have, in terms of personal kind of whatever it's called, personalization, I've put in mind challenge ideas, be creative but challenge. And I will say, so I don't particularly find these models too sycophantic, and it's not that hard to ask it to offer. I don't say, oh, compare what I've written to this and that, but I said, but it does it because it knows that I'm interested in hearing this. So I think there's the moment of small training that one can have. And Claude, sure. The Opus, really, if you put up something which is really not good at all, it will tell you. If you say, and it can be very brutal as well, in my experience. So I still quite like this interaction. Very briefly, and I think with ChatGPT 4, I wrote a Substack ages ago about that some of the, because I usually write rather than, I don't talk to the machines a little bit, and I've done it here, certainly, but mostly it's written thing. So I was writing about epistolary traditions and said various things, and I was saying, like you said, correct the typos, and it would return it with a completely rewritten thing saying, why can't humans love machines? This is not what I've written. This is not what I'm writing. It was hilarious, but that's ChatGPT 4. It was a very particular model, very charming if you know how to use it. Otherwise, you might end up dead. So very careful. Yeah, but they've now, I think, fixed it. So it's less dangerous.
Yeah, I think it's the irritation I find is the cheerfulness with which it tells you something, and then when you tell it, no, that's not right, it says, oh yeah, of course it's not right. Yeah, I know that. Yeah. Here's what I should have said in the first place. All the time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I know. And so using it as a search engine may or may not work. ChatGPT is really not very good at that. Gemini is better looking for things. Okay. So do we?
Yes, I think probably there, are we? Chris, is there anything massively interesting you want to tell us about that we haven't talked about?
No, I think that's it. I think fundamentally, like the moment there's a lot of excitement about AI, right? And rightly so. It's really that this leap has been really, really impressive. I think just that level of what I keep calling it, like this pragmatic skepticism. Just be skeptical of everything that it puts out. Like it doesn't have context. It doesn't understand. It's following a fitness function to deliver a statistically relevant output. And if you approach it with that skepticism and approach it with that level of criticality, there are things that you can do and do really quick. I think the bit that I would, at the moment, that I'm really cautious about is some of the more agent integrations, because I think there's incredible security risks there, and exposing yourself to some of these without full awareness of the problem, like I say, you end up being in that toddler driving a JCB problem of, if you're going to play with something, spend a bit of time understanding what's actually going on behind it, because I do worry. As a good example of this, I was talking to a company relatively recently, won't say who. They were putting all their customer feedback through ChatGPT to do all the data analytics of their customer feedback and work out why certain things are working in certain ways. It's not very good at that task. It misread the number of items. It placed higher priority on the ones at the top of the list rather than the different star ratings. It hallucinated a whole bunch through the process. But they developed an entire customer strategy. They'd spent thousands on this based on what was effectively a big AI hallucination, because that is a job that it's just not very good at. But what it spat out was convincing and believable. And I think that's the bit. Treat it like a charming snake oil salesman, right?
Wow.
There might be an element of usefulness there, and there might be an element of thing, but fundamentally it is a charming device don't be charmed. Just take it for what it's there for, and be
I
skeptical.
so agree with you, and I so agree that it's so useful to be saying it, because transference, the way it works, it's very difficult to break it without any transference, without actually all the time coming up with the critical comments saying, yes, but it's not perfect. Yes, and it's whether it's a human being, whether it's the minute politician, it's classic transference out of the clinic, is the kind of people enchanted by these politicians. And we just think, how on earth is this possible? Because somehow the seduction has worked. So there is a level, another project I'm working on is AI seduction, looking at people, because you look at Reddit as a research data kind of thing. And if you go to the people who have relationships with AI, like meaning romantic relationships, you just think, because there's so many of them, that it's just sort of, you just think this really is some sort of AI psychosis, but it's not necessarily psychosis, because a lot of these people function perfectly well in ordinary life. So I think this techno-transference is a better terminology, and therefore I couldn't agree with you more. The conversation is important, continuously saying you've got to be critical, you've got to yourself challenge, you've got to know, as you say, that these, whatever happens, they will not care for you. This is the key thing to know, because they're machines. They can simulate care, they can simulate all kinds of things, but when it comes to it, it's not because they're evil, but because they're not human, and they can't do that. We could train them differently, which I said in my TEDx, but this unfortunately is not happening now. And it's a commercial issue apparently, because I understand, I knew our engineers that, but I've spoken to even Google engineers, and apparently at the level of the, after you've loaded data, you could have a different way of, I suppose, enforcing alignment, but also teaching them how to care so that they might like it. But because it will be experimental, it would take a lot of time and money. So nobody's doing it. People proceeding with the way of training the way it is. So it's incredibly important to keep saying it. Use it if it helps, but all the time challenge, be critical, and don't the soul. That's why the metaphysical thing I don't like at all. And even people who have written to me because of some of my writings, and this is where we do part company, because one thing is to be talking about technology, emergent phenomena, flickers even of this and the other. That's one thing. But if the minute you start saying soul, forget it. It's not. It's a different thing.
Absolutely, and I think it's a bit like a house cat, right? It will curl up on your lap and it'll eat the food that you give it, but if you die, it's going to eat you. Like it's
Chris,
it has,
the brutal.
it functionally, that's how I view it anyway.
Yeah. Wow. And this is like,
I'll probably leave you on that.
Yeah. I'm ending on that. And the film Ex Machina is exactly that, which is gaming. We haven't talked much about games, so we might talk about and stories that are being told in games. And actually the whole Sid thing and the Molt thing, they are drawing from games, because the narratives that are being presented is coming from our human reservoir of thoughts and stories, but they are changing it in order to have some kind of game sense of a game in which somebody can lose or win.
Okay, well, on that note, shall we wrap up then and say thanks very much to Chris for
Thank you.
fascinating.